Me again, as so often. So please excuse my stuttering. Then I introduce Chris Downing, who has been an inspiration for so many people, for myself. For those who have not read any of her books, they should definitely do so. In the newsletter, you have read about Chris Downing as a professional woman, about her books, about a teacher at San Diego State University, and so forth. So I can skip that very easily. Now, let me see what I have put down, what has to be said to you. I put down these things very quickly. Let me see. Okay, here I said that Chris Downing is more than a gifted author, more than a professional teacher, more than a true scholar, because she's a mother of 5 and a proud and very loving grandmother of 2. I have met Chris a few years ago at the campus of San Diego State University. I was coming towards the campus while she was just leaving. She greeted me, a stranger, very much joyful, very radiant. And I was startled about that. So I was wondering, what was that? Who was she? A little later I met her in a lecture here at Friends of Jung, and I learned who that radiant mystery woman is. To me, Chris has become more than a teacher, more than an admired author. She has become a deeply respected friend. And it is with the greatest pleasure that I present you Chris Downing tonight.
Thank you very much. We are friends, and that means a lot to me. What I'm going to be trying to address this evening is a woman's view of the masculine. And I'm going to approach that by way of a talk that I'm calling Gods in Our Midst. When I chose the title, I hoped that many who read it might catch the allusion to a paper that Philip Zabriskie published a long while ago now. It wasn't until I looked it up this afternoon that I realized how very long ago it was. It's a paper that appeared in Quadrant, a publication of the New York Analytical Society, in 1974. And it was a paper called Goddesses in Our Midst. And I remember that paper especially because it was published at just the time that I myself was beginning to get interested in Greek goddesses. And I had just sort of scribbled out for myself my own relationship to a particular one of those goddesses, Hera. As I was coming to terms with the ending of a 25-year marriage and wanting to understand as deeply as I could exactly what it meant to me to have been a wife and to no longer be a wife. And I spent a whole weekend scribbling about Hera as a way of sorting that through for myself. And when I'd finished that, I decided that I wanted to share what I'd written with my husband, who at that time and still now was living 3,000 miles away. And I had no idea at all whether he'd be able to make any sense of what I'd written, because he wasn't someone who's particularly attuned to mythology or the symbolic way of looking at things. But it had been such an important way for me of discovering what our marriage had meant and what its joys and its difficulties really added up to, that I decided I would risk it and send this paper to him. And almost immediately, I got back a response from him which included a copy of Philip Zabriskie's paper, which he had read just about the same time that my letter had come. And he said, "Chris, as I was reading Zabriskie's paper, I was realizing that Hera was the goddess, in fact the deity, who'd been ruling over my life for a long while. And so what you wrote to me just made perfectly good sense. That paper of Zabriskie's was a man's view of the goddesses, a man's appreciation of the important way in which the Greek goddesses represent energies that he as a man inevitably found himself confronting. And so it seemed to me that as I wanted to try and use the Greek gods as a way of exploring our women's experience of the masculine and of men, that to allude to Zabriskie's title would be a way of communicating what I had in mind. Let me name a few things that led me to want to try and address this issue this evening. One of them was learning a year or so ago, it might be 2 years by now, that Jean Bolin was working on a book called Gods in Every Man. And that seemed a very appropriate follow-up to her earlier book, Goddesses in Every Woman. And yet when I heard of her project, I found myself thinking, well, if I were going to be writing about the gods, I wouldn't be writing about the gods as men know them. I wouldn't feel that I would really be in a position to speak to that I would need to begin with my own experience, that I would need to begin by trying to say how I experience the gods, how I relate to them, and then more or less feel that I would leave it up to men to discover whatever congruence there might be between my experience of the gods and their own. I've certainly found that many men have read my book on the goddesses or have taken courses with me devoted to those female deities, and they've not had much trouble discovering that those deities are important to them and discovering for themselves what their relationship is, that I can't do that for them. I can only speak of mine, of a woman's. I was also moved to want to come and talk about this topic to this particular group, because last spring, as some of you may remember, the Friends of Jung here in San Diego had a series dedicated to the masculine. And at the very top of the page announcing this series, there was a one-liner to the effect that the relevance of the masculine to the psychologies of both women and men was going to be addressed. But then as you read down to see exactly what topics were going to be discussed and who was going to be presenting them, I discovered that it was all going to be male speakers, and that what they, quite appropriately, were going to be focusing on was the masculine in the psychology of men. And I wrote Denise about my delight that Jungians were recognizing the importance of looking at the masculine, because Jungians have had a kind of history of spending a lot more time on the feminine than we do on the masculine. But also my surprise that now that we were finally getting around to looking at the masculine, we were doing so entirely from the perspective of male experience. Because as I was aware, and I imagine all of you are as well, Jungians all over the place are always doing things about the feminine. And I've never been aware of a Jungian exploration of the feminine that hasn't had at least as many men talking about what the feminine means as it has had women talking about it. So it just seemed to me that maybe if we were really going to be trying to look at what role the masculine plays in human experience, we'd need on some occasion to try and explore what it means from the perspective of women as well. Another reason that I wanted to come here and begin this exploration is that it's here at Friends of Jung that I began my exploration of the Greek goddesses long, long ago. I don't know exactly when that was. It might have been in 74 or 75 as well, that I came here and spoke about my exploration of the goddess Persephone and of how much that exploration had illumined my self-understanding. So I want to begin simply by saying that I was deeply pleased to discover this group of Jungians here, recognizing that it was time that we begin exploring the masculine, and very pleased indeed that it was men who were taking the initiative in that exploration. I think that some of the work that Jim Hillman has done on speaking of the importance to men of focusing on the relationship between puer and senex, on images of male-male bonding, rather than always focusing on the relationship to anima and to the mother, is a very important and needed move for men to begin to make. As I've also very much welcomed Eugene Monnick's really new exploration of the phallus and of this image of male potency and so on. I think those things are very important to be doing. I also see more reason than I may have at first admitted to there being a little dissymmetry in the way in which we approach the feminine and the way in which we approach the masculine. Because I do have a very deep conviction that the feminine means something different and more central in the psychology of men than the masculine means in the psychology of women. I think that there are lots of reasons for that. One of them, a very important one, may be that all of us, men and women alike, are born of mothers. All of us have as our earliest, most powerful experience a relationship to the feminine. And it may be that because of that, throughout our lives, our sense of a connection to wholeness, our sense of a connection to the source, our sense of connection to the soul, to the depths, and so on, will, for men and women alike, more often appear as a connection to the feminine, rather than as a connection to the masculine. I'm not the first to make this kind of suggestion. Another one of those 1974 writings was Irena Claremont de Castelleo's book, Knowing Woman. And one of my favorite essays is the last essay in that book, the book that she calls Soul Images of Women. An essay in which she recognizes that after decades of trying to fit her own deepest experiences and the deepest experiences of the women that she'd worked with in analysis into Jungian theory about the animus, she'd realized that that theory didn't really quite fit. That although, of course, there are important images of men and of the masculine and of males in women's psychology, the images which connect us most deeply to our own souls and to the growth of the souls seem so often to be images that are feminine rather than male. And I've also learned a good deal from another contribution of Jim Hillman's. In his essays on the anima, his recognition that we need to free anima from its contrasexual associations, and to recognize that not only men have animas, but that we women also do. And another foray in this same direction that I found illuminating and helpful is Damaris Ware's quite recent book on Jung and feminism, in which she explores, in a way that I don't want to take the trouble to do this evening, the real inadequacy of Jung's theory of the animus, and the way in which Jung himself discovered that he'd come to the idea because of his conviction that female and male psychology would obviously be complementary psychologies, and he knew very well, on the basis of his own experience and of his work with his male patients, that men do have an anima. And his assumption then was that something symmetrical would be true for us, and that the animus, a male inner figure, would play an exactly parallel kind of role in our psychology. And Jung confesses himself his bewilderment at the fact that female patient after female patient would tell him, I don't quite get it. But as I say, I don't want to really spend this evening working at that kind of a theoretical level. I don't want to spend the time arguing with anima theory and animus theory, nor do I want to spend time criticizing the notion that androgyny represents the best possible model for human wholeness. Those are all issues that I'm afraid we get mired in. And some of you would right away say, yes, I get it, and others of you would have discovered that traditional Jungian theory has been enormously helpful and supportive for you, and we just spend the whole time tangled up in that. And I don't want to. I want to point to the issues, but I don't want to stay with them. And I also don't want to get stuck in arguing with conventional, traditional notions of what constitutes the feminine and what constitutes the masculine, and does that get us anywhere nowadays when our whole sense of what women are supposed to be like and what men are supposed to be like is so much in flux. I want to begin instead by saying that despite my discomfort with some of the inherited theory, and despite my dis-ease with conventional stereotypical notions about femininity and masculinity, I still know, as I'm sure every woman in this room knows, that both in our outward lives and in our dreams, male figures appear with power to confuse and to transform. I'm very aware that I, for instance, even though this doesn't fit in all that well with my politics or even with my psychological theory, have had powerful dreams, among my most unforgettable dreams, dreams in which I knew myself to be a man. Not just dreams about men, but dreams in which I was present in a very important way as a man, and felt even that the dreamer was in some way a man. And I also had a dream just at the time that I was approaching menopause of discovering myself growing male genitalia. I was, in this dream, I had taken my daughter, that was what I thought was happening in the dream at the beginning, I had taken my daughter to participate in a puberty ritual. And what I was doing, I was taking her to visit the same wise old woman that my mother, according to the dream at least, had taken me to when I was approaching puberty myself. And so my dream daughter and I went to visit this wise old woman, this German fairy tale witch. And when we came to her little house that was right on the edge of a forest, she opened the door and looked just as wizened and kindly and bent as she had looked when I'd come to her as a child. And I was delighted that she recognized me, and she was delighted that I still cared enough about this traditional ritual to have come and brought my daughter. And she sent us out to gather kindling and to gather a whole list of herbs, which we did. And by the time we returned with her orders fulfilled, night had fallen. She led us back into her very overgrown yard and had us build fires under 2 tubs that were in the backyard. And I was a little surprised because in my memory there had been just 1 tub. But I figured that she was the one who knew about the ritual, and I'd trust her. So we built the fires under the 2 tubs, and she sprinkled some herbs on the top of 1 tub and some herbs on the top of another. And then she led my daughter into 1 tub, and then to my surprise took me by the elbow and led me to the other. And so I lowered myself into the tub and felt the comforting warmth of the water and felt that the herbs in the water were having a very magical effect of making me aware that my consciousness was being loosened and moved in very unusual kinds of directions. And then I felt a kind of tingling at my groin, which became more and more persistent. And finally I reached down to discover just what was going on, and as I've already said, discovered that I'd grown a penis and testicles. I understood that dream as in part meaning that at menopause, women are freed to explore energies and social roles and so on that have very often been relegated to men during our reproductive years. Certainly this is something that is true in many traditional and primitive cultures. Really didn't want to mention that dream here really so much for that, but just to suggest that there are many different ways, both in our outward lives and in our dreams, that we discover that our connection to men and to the masculine is very important and powerful. Now, as I was looking for a way of exploring this relationship to the masculine that would prevent our getting all stuck in theory and argument and revisioning, I decided to begin by looking at the Greek gods. Looking at the major Greek gods and seeing what in them I might find relevant to my own self-understanding and what I might find in them that might be relevant to the self-understanding of other women as well. There's a line of Rilke that speaks very deeply to me. I actually used the same line a year ago here when I was talking about the Egyptian gods and goddesses. But it seems equally relevant for what I want to talk about this evening. Rilke says, "Let none of the gods vanish. We need each and every one. Every one should matter to us. Every perfected image." This, it seems to me, is precisely the teaching of polytheism. That only the totality, only all the gods, by which I would mean all the gods and goddesses, constitute the divine world. I think it's very important that among the Greek deities, none of them ever dispute one another's existence, and that in Greek mythology, over and over again, there are stories making it clear that it is fatal to overlook any one of them. To overlook or to despise is to curtail the richness of the world and the fullness of the human. For the Greeks, although there were some rituals devoted to a god or a goddess that were exclusive to members of one gender or another, there were, for instance, Dionysian rituals and Apollonian rituals in which only men could participate. And there were rituals dedicated to Athena, to Hera, and to Demeter, which were only open to women. Nevertheless, there was no god or goddess that wasn't worshipped by both men and women. The rituals might on occasion be gender specific. Some of the gods and goddesses were attended only by members of their own gender, so that some of the gods had only male priests and some of the goddesses had only female priestesses. But the Greeks were well aware that every god was one that women worshippers needed to discover their relationship to, needed to honor their relationship to. And that likewise, the goddesses were there as beings, as energies that men needed to come to terms with. Polytheism means that this complex of gods and goddesses together constitute a totality, which is incomplete unless every one of them is included. On the other hand, the way in which this whole is constituted is not something that is neat, logical, closed, harmonious, or in place. There's no sort of logical way of sorting out exactly who these various gods and goddesses are and what their relationship might be to one another. A book that I value very much, Walter Burkert's book, Greek Religion, says the language of polytheism can only be learned passively. We must open ourselves to let each god reveal himself. I think that's very important. And it's something that I was very aware as I was putting together what I'm saying this evening, that I haven't really fully done yet. That my presentation here this evening is still very much at a beginning phase. But I understand the real importance of what Burkert is saying here, which is that the only way we really get to know the gods of polytheism is through opening ourselves up to them, letting them reveal themselves to us in all their complexity. So, in a moment, I'm going to begin looking at each of the major Greek gods. And what I tried to do as I was doing this, and what I would like to invite you to do as I speak a little about each one of them, is to ask yourselves, what do I know of this energy, of the particular energy, the particular pattern of behavior, the particular kind of sacred power that this God represents, or that that God represents? What do I know of that? How has it entered my life? Is it something I know mostly as an outward experience, primarily perhaps through interpersonal relationships? Or is this energy, this particular sacred power, something that I also know inwardly, that I know as part of my inner experience? This is in some way part of my own psychic wholeness. Is the particular energy represented by a Hermes or an Apollo or a Hades or whatever? Is that energy that I experience as alien energy, which pulls me away from myself or which enters into me, or as part of my own being? And my expectation would be that because each one of these deities is indeed quite different from any other, that with some we would say, that one I know only outside. That one I know only is embodied, perhaps in some men I know. A father, a brother, a lover, a husband. Or that one I know as being very much part of my own being here. That one, when I've experienced, comes as invasion, as abduction, as from outside. Or that other one is something that is part of me. I also think that one of the things that we want to consider is what happens as I become perhaps a little more specifically aware than I'm used to of the particular differentiated kind of energy pattern associated with this deity, this God, as contrasted with some other God. This God, what unhonored strengths does this God perhaps enable me to name, to get in touch with? What dark, maybe often hidden or unacknowledged urges or fears does this God represent? Or what ignored suffering, pain in my life is this particular deity's energy connected with? One of the things that I've always been interested in as I look at mythology, as I looked at the goddesses, is the way in which they don't just get us in touch with unacknowledged powers, but bring us in touch with the darker, more difficult, more painful sides of our lives. And I think that's true with respect to these gods as well. The gods have dark sides just as much as the goddesses do. Jung, as you may remember, said that the gods have become our pathologies. And one of the things we might think about is the degree to which that's true for any one of us with respect to some of these particular images. I'm interested in the Greek gods for some of the same reasons that I've for so long been interested in the Greek goddesses. And that is for the very differentiated representation of the masculine that they offer us. That just as there's a world of difference between talking about the goddess and talking about Athena and Artemis and Aphrodite and so on. So there's a world of difference between talking about the masculine and talking about the diverse epiphanies of the masculine represented by the various gods. To really do what I'm going to begin doing this evening would, of course, require our spending an evening, at least, on every one of these gods. It would require looking with care at every myth that we could get hold of that involves this god and that god, and all their variants, because so often it's the little difference between this way the story got told and that other way the story got told that is where a lot of the juice, a lot of the illumination lies. It would mean looking at all the attributes associated with any one of these deities and all the epithets by which they're addressed. And particularly as we're interested in exploring how each of these gods relates to women's experience, it would mean focusing in a very careful way at the stories that are told about how each one of these gods was involved with the various goddesses and with particular human women. I have by no means done that yet. What I do want to do is to talk in more general terms, with some references to particular tales and so on, about these major gods. Enough to give you some sense, I hope, of the particular ones that might be really relevant to you just now. The ones that you recognize as familiars, or the ones that you recognize as strangers that it's important for you to get to know better, or whatever. My own sense is that this kind of exploration really needs to be done in a one-by-one kind of way. I certainly found that when I was working with the goddesses, that it would not have worked at all had I undertaken a project at the beginning of, I'm going to deal with all the Greek goddesses. What I found instead was being pulled by my own life to have to deal with Persephone at one point. And then a year later, because of things going on in my life, actually things I've already named, finding I wanted very powerfully, really needed to look at who Hera really is in relation to me. It isn't really something that works trying to do it all at once. You have to go by the rhythms of your life, or maybe the rhythms of the gods. That's part of what Burkert means, I think, by saying that this is an exploration that in a sense has to be done passively. Can't quite really be done in the on-purpose way that I rashly agreed to do it 6 months ago or whatever. That doesn't mean we can't start this way, but it just means that this is just a preliminary kind of invitation to something that has to be undertaken in a different way to be really done. As I was reflecting on which of the Greek gods to begin with, it seemed to me evident that I would need to begin with Hades. That doesn't mean that that would be the right god for anyone else to begin with. I have to begin with Hades because Hades is the one that got me into all this stuff to begin with. My initial pull to really discover how Greek mythology might illumine our understanding of ourselves ended up being a pull to look at Persephone. And who pulls at Persephone? It's Hades. So I decided to begin with him this evening. Hades, as I imagine all of you know, is the god of the underworld. Brother to Zeus and Poseidon. Unlike Zeus, he and Poseidon, along with Hestia, Demeter, and Hera, have been swallowed at birth by their father Cronus, who feared that one day one of his children might seize power from him, as he knew perfectly well he had seized it from his father. And so to avert that, he decided to swallow his children immediately after their birth. Eventually, as I imagine most of you remember, their mother, Rhea, caught on, and when her sixth child was born, tricked her husband into swallowing a stone instead of the child, and sent Zeus off to be raised safely by his grandmother. And eventually, Zeus grew up and managed to trick his father into swallowing an emetic and vomiting forth those 5 swallowed siblings. And then Zeus took over as the most important of the gods and ready to share his power with his sisters and his brother. And what happened was that the 3 male gods divided the world among them. Zeus took the heavens, Poseidon took the sea, and Hades was given the underworld. And there he lived, an invisible and mostly unnamed god, a god who had no temples and no rituals, Although at Eleusis, where the temple of Demeter and Persephone and the rituals associated with the underworld were practiced, were celebrated, there is a cave, very different from a beautiful Greek marble temple. There is a cave where Hades was honored, but that's the only temple in all of Greece dedicated to Hades. Hades is sometimes spoken of as the underworld or the chthonic Zeus. Hades is the god of the underworld, and yet there are almost no stories told about him, and in Homer, he's really given no honor as a god that one would worship at all. Homer seems to have no recognition that there's anything really sacred, anything really divine about the realm of the dead. Hades was for the Greeks not only the name of the god, but also the name of the place where he reigned. And in many ways, Hades seems to be almost more place than person. A little bit in that respect, a little bit like Hestia, who's more the place of the hearth in the home, and really not plot in the ordinary sense, not very many stories associated with her. According to the myths, the only time that Hades ever emerges from his underworld realm is to abduct Persephone. One day, as you remember, Persephone is playing in the meadow with some other young maidens of her own age, making wreaths and flowery necklaces for one another. And then Persephone espies an especially large and beautiful narcissus at the edge of the meadow, goes to pluck it, discovers that what she's done is to pull out the whole plant. Where the bulb had been, the opening in the earth grows larger and larger, and from out of it, Hades appears, pulls her into his arms, and pulls her down into his underworld realm. Then Persephone becomes his consort, comes to learn to love him, and indeed, in most Greek accounts of the underworld, Persephone becomes really the dominant deity associated with the underworld, more important than the male god, more important than Hades. The Greeks also speak of death as a marriage to Hades. Okay, so this is sort of the basic material about Hades. As I've reflected on that, it seems to me that the questions that we need to ask in trying to understand what kind of relevance might this God have to us as we try to understand our lives deeply, is that Hades is obviously the God who pulls into the underworld. And I think that what we need to reflect on is, what is it that pulls us to underworld experience? What is it? Or to a person taken into the underworld. She's taken from her mother, and her mother really is also pulled to an underworld experience, because her mother rages and grieves at having lost this daughter. And it's in some way having lost her role, her identity, which has been being a mother. And Demeter is forced to discover that motherhood means loss, that she needs to come to terms in some way or other with the end of her motherhood, with the task of discovering what else there is besides being mother. So it seems to me that for us women, that one of the things, and you may think of other things as well, that Hades represents is that which pulls us away from contentment with our biological feminine roles, pulls us away from identification with our mother role. Another thing, Demeter had tried to raise Persephone in a way that would utterly exclude males from their world. She had allowed Zeus to impregnate her because, unlike her grandmother Gaia, she wasn't capable of parthenogenetic conception. But once Zeus had impregnated her, she was determined not to allow him any access to this daughter that was going to be hers. And she clearly hoped to raise her daughter in a way that would completely protect her daughter from any involvement with the world of men. And so it seems to me that another thing that this Hades story is suggesting is that there's a way in which, in order to come to our fullness as women, come to ourselves, we can't do that by trying to shut ourselves off from the masculine and males. There's some way or other that's going to get to us and demand to be accounted for. I think it's important that the flower that Persephone reaches for is a narcissus, which is really a symbol of self, a symbol of a differentiated, one's own being. And again, this is just an idea. See whether it has some resonance, whether it seems to have some kind of truth for you. I read in this tale a kind of suggestion that perhaps for women, soul-making and ego-making may not be completely contradictory experiences. That it may be very important for us as part of our relationship to our souls to really move towards a kind of individuated, differentiated selfhood, which is what we ordinarily mean by ego. Maybe lots of other things that Hades means. This is just a beginning. You might reflect on whether, as you think about those experiences which have pulled you to the kind of soul-making that has to do with the discovery of your identity in a way that isn't tied up to being mother and all that kind of stuff, whether there's something about that that seems appropriately to be imaged by a male abductor. Let me go on now to another god. Let me talk just for a few minutes about Hermes. Hermes is, in Greek mythology, a messenger god, and particularly a psychopomp. Hermes delivers all kinds of messages and guides people along many journeys. But most importantly, he's the god who leads people to the underworld and also has the capacity to lead them out. So that in the Persephone story, for example, when Demeter's refusal to do all the things that she usually can be counted on to do, like making sure that the grain grows, her refusal to do that because of her complete immersion in her grief and rage. When that persuades Zeus that Hades is going to have to let Persephone go, it's Hermes that he sends down to bring Persephone back, as it's Hermes that leads Theseus and Odysseus and Orpheus and everyone else, really, who journeys to the underworld, leads them there and leads them back up. And I know that in my own life, that that's one of the most important ways that Hermes has functioned, is as a rescuer from getting lost in underworld experience. That the underworld is a very important place to spend time in, but that's different from getting stuck there forever. Some other thing, I'll return to that in a moment, but some other things about Hermes. Hermes is associated with boundaries. You may remember that, and I wasn't able to hear Monic's speech, but I imagine he spoke a little bit about this. He certainly writes about it in his book. That for the way in which the Greeks marked boundaries and borders, it was with herms, with stones in the shape of a phallus. And this is where this area ends, and this is where this other kind of an area begins. So Hermes associated with boundaries, but particularly with the transgression of boundaries. He marks the boundaries and then he violates them. And it's one of the important things about Hermes, the suggestion that to be a rule breaker, a taboo violator, can at certain times be the most creative and appropriate thing to do. Hermes is, and this reminds me of Brigida's introduction, Hermes is, of course, the trickster god among the Greeks. A god known for secrecy, for cunning, a god who lies, who steals. He's also a god associated with luck, mostly good luck, but if you're associated with luck, it means you also have to be associated with bad luck. Hermes was also spoken of as the friendliest of gods to men. As I reflect on what Hermes might mean, among the questions that come up for me is, what are our experiences of being guided to the underworld? I think that's very different from being abducted to the underworld. Hades abducts us to the underworld. But sometimes we go there, in a more deliberate kind of way. And what are our experiences of being led back out? I think one of the questions that seems to me that arises in connection with this is the whole issue of male therapists for women. And what particular times in our lives do we, for reasons that we do or don't fully understand, feel that I want a male guide at this point? I think that's part of what's involved here. Hermes is, of course, an interpreter. Hermeneutics comes from the name Hermes. That's one of the things that messengers do. They help us understand the message. They're translators. They help the message from one place be understood in the next place. Hermes is associated very much with the interpretation of dreams. So another question that occurs to me is, what in us, what in me, knows how to learn from, make use of underworld experience, which again is different from just being sucked down into having underworld experience. I think also of the trickster. There's a trickster in all of us. And does it, as we try and get a feel of who the trickster in me is, in me, there's not just a trickster, there's someone that I would call a kind of sociopath. I'm serious. There are times like that. And sort of explore, is that sociopath in me, does that feel like appropriately more imaged as a kind of masculine energy? Is there something about that particular sparkly, tricky secret, cunning way of being that is appropriately imaged as masculine? Or does that not feel right to us? These are the questions that we need to ask. And the role of luck. I think it's very important for us to think about luck in our lives. Those moments when, things just happen. Not because of deserving or looking for or anything like that, but the gifts that come that are just suddenly there. And who do we thank for them? What's that whole experience of what our relationship is to that Hermes? Also interested in Dionysus. Dionysus was the Greek god who was sometimes spoken of as the womanly god, the feminine god. I, this summer, have been writing a book about same-sex love, both male-male love and women-women love. And I was very interested to discover that among the rituals dedicated to Dionysus are male rituals in which Greek adult men allowed themselves to be penetrated. Now, if you know anything about the ethos of Greek homoerotic love, you will know how counter this was to that ethos, where the adult male was always the active partner. And there was a notion that there was something really shameful about taking on what we think of as the feminine role. And yet, in the Dionysian cult, adult males took on this role as though, on the other side of being really assured of your masculinity in a conventional kind of way, was enormously important to come to terms with receptivity, with vulnerability, with femininity, if you were going to move towards a complete male identity. Very, very striking if you know some of the Greek prejudices about what maleness is all about. But why I'm interested in Dionysus this evening is that he was also a god of women. And that there were cults associated, rituals associated with Dionysus, to which only women were allowed. And men caught spying on women were liable to be castrated, killed, whatever. I mean, this was women-only stuff. Women and the god. And the women who were devoted to Dionysus were known as Maenads. Not just in myth, where the priestesses and the followers of Dionysus were known as Maenads, but in actual ritual culture during the time when women, for a short interval, would leave their homes, their husbands, their children, to go to the mountaintops and spend a short interval honoring this god. They were known as Maenads. And what we know of those rituals suggests that it was a time devoted to women celebrating their own sexual energy in a way that somehow the god helped to release, but that involved didn't involve men at all, that in fact rejected men, that a real recognition that in some way women's sexual energy, our instinctual energy, is our own and can be experienced most fully in a context where men are not present. And yet, it's the god that enabled them to do that. That it was being somehow given permission, temporarily, briefly, to leave the role of mother, to leave the role of wife, to simply go and discover, who am I when all social constraints are removed? What is my energy really like? Dionysus is, of course, the god associated with ecstasy, whether it's sexual ecstasy, whether it's the ecstasy induced by alcohol, whether it's the ecstasy of religious possession, whether it's the ecstasy of madness. There's always danger when Dionysus is around. The danger of being overwhelmed, the danger of being taken away from ourselves. But also the suggestion, when the Greeks recognized that Dionysus is a god, there's a sense that there's a way in which, in those very moments when we're taken away from ourselves as we ordinarily know ourselves, that we're in a very profound way brought in touch with ourselves. And that's what Dionysus is all about. Very different, I really need to make clear, from Aphrodite. Aphrodite is also women's sexual energy, but Aphrodite is sexual passion directed towards another. They take hold of us in ways that are overwhelming and destructive, as well as beautiful and creative and so on. But what all those myths that showed Aphrodite's power are all about is how I have this consuming passion for just this person, and it may be the world's most inappropriate person, incest, and all kinds of things. But it's very other-focused. That's not what Dionysus is about. Dionysus is about the arousal for its own sake, my experience of my sexuality, of my passion, of my instinctuality. I think that's a very different kind of energy. Another deity, but I think it's important for us to reflect on and see what role might this one play in our self-understanding, in our lives. Hephaestus, the Greek god of fire, the smith, which means that he's connected to alchemy, preeminently the artisan god, the craftsperson god, the god who is so skillful and adept at making truly beautiful things, but also the only one among the Greek gods and goddesses who is crippled, who is not a physically perfect being. Hephaestus's feet are deformed. He limps. He's the peacemaker among the gods. He's always trying to somehow make things okay between Hera and Zeus, between his parents. He's also an introvert. One of the things that is striking about the tales told about Hephaestus is how over and over again he's rejected by goddesses. Some way or other, this is an aspect of the masculine that gets rejected by females, the feminine, whatever we want to call it. He's rejected by his mother. According to at least one story, Hephaestus is a child that Hera created out of her own being, that she created parthenogenetically, that is her child and not Zeus's. A son that she created to prove to Zeus that if he could have a daughter, Athena, she could have a son. Unfortunately, her son was born crippled, and that upset her, and so she rejected him. There's a story that Hephaestus one time was aroused, sexually aroused, by Athena. He found her irresistible. He approached her and told her that he wanted to make love to her. But of course, Athena is one of the virgin goddesses. She didn't want to play. But by this time, Hephaestus was so turned on that he ejaculated. And Athena, with great disdain, wiped the semen off her thigh. It fell to the earth, impregnated Gaia, and Erecthonius, the first Athenian, was eventually born. But again, a story of being rejected. And the other story is that, according to Homer at least, Hephaestus was married to Aphrodite. Of course, it's sort of ridiculous for anybody to think they could marry Aphrodite. And the consequence was the obvious consequence that Hephaestus was cuckolded. Again, rejected. I think we need to reflect a little bit about what masculine, what aspect of the masculine do we as women get pulled to reject. And I see two things that might be part of the answer here. One is that, I'm sad about this, but I think that maybe I'll just say me, I, respond more ambivalently than I wish I did to precisely the gentle, creative, artistic men that I long for, that I think I value, that I mostly actually end up relating to. But that there's a part of me that rejects them because they're not quite men. Something weird going on there. But that, I decided to just talk about me, and you can decide whether there's any kind of resonance in this for you. But I think it's intriguing that it's this gentlest and most creative of the gods that gets rejected by goddess after goddess after goddess. And important for us to reflect at least on what could that be about and in what way might that be relevant to us. Something else that I suggested in my chapter on Hera in the Goddess book is that both Hephaestus and his brother Ares, who's the god I'm going to talk about next, are sons of Hera, and in some ways seem to be animus figures for her in a fairly conventional understanding of what the animus is like. And that one of the, among the other things that Hephaestus might represent in the psychology of women is the way in which our creativity has been wounded and crippled. Because here he is, he's the artist God, the creative God, and yet the wounded God. And some way or other, that woundedness and that creativity go together. Ares, the god of war. Not, and I think this is real important, an admirable figure to the Greeks. Not the god who represents their image of admirable heroism. He's not the hero writ large. Ares is a god who is insatiable in battle, destructive, manslaughterer, not even very effective as a fighter, but always wanting to pick a fight, and not having any sense at all that when you've won, you could quit. He just keeps going. Even his father Zeus says to him, "You were the most hateful to me of all the gods." Ares is someone that I recognize as as an energy that takes hold of me sometimes. I recognize very well how assertiveness and courage can get turned around, get weird, become aggressiveness, become hubristic bravado. And I think that's what Aries is about. There's a clean way for women. There's a clean, beautiful way of being self-confident, assertive, fighting for what we need, being angry when it's appropriate to be angry, being courageous. But precisely because a lot of us weren't really raised to know how to do that or encouraged to do it, we sometimes do it in a messed up kind of way. Do it with a little too much edge on it, a little too much insistence. And I think that that's what Aries is about. But I'm also interested that Aries is the god that Aphrodite fell in love with. The god that Aphrodite had most of her children with. The god that Aphrodite cuckolded Hephaestus with. Aphrodite saw something very attractive in this god, or perhaps with her, he was attractive in a way that separated from her. He wasn't. But we might reflect a little on that as well. Apollo, known as the god who comes from afar. The god, at least in most accounts, identified with clarity, with coolness, with calmness. The god who says nothing in excess. The god whose motto at Delphi was, know yourself, which to the Greeks didn't mean the kind of knowing of ourselves that we come to when we do deep analysis. It meant something simpler, but maybe also more difficult. It meant, no, you are not a god. Apollo was also the leader of the Muses. He was a god of plague and of healing, a god of purification, a god who represented the possibility of having our most heinous crimes expiated. Like most deities, what he did, he also suffered, and so among the interesting stories about Apollo are the fact that he himself 3 times had to go through a very radical purifying trial. Is the oracle god. Although his oracles were always very indirect and veiled, and probably the most familiar epithet that the Greeks had for Apollo was Apollo Loxias, Apollo the oblique. He was also the youth among the Greek gods, the Kouros, who was always represented as being at that moment of life when a youth becomes a man, that moment of transition to manhood. And because of that, among the most touching stories that are told about Apollo are his own initiations of youths to help them make that transition. And the stories of Apollo's loves of young men are always stories that end in tragedy, always stories that end with those youths dying. Because, of course, Apollo is all about the difference between gods and men. Gods and humans. Humans die. And Apollo has to experience that himself. When I think of Apollo and what this particular deity might mean to us, a lot of things occur to me. One is that inner relationship between plague and healing, that somehow that which brings the hurt, the wound, the disease is the same as that which will somehow bring healing, cure, purification. I think that Apollo, for all of us, men and women alike, represents the capacity for objectivity, clarity, balance, beautiful values, often needed, but along with them, obviously, the danger of losing touch with feeling. I'm interested that Apollo is the brother to Artemis. Very important part of his story is the way in which he is brother to Artemis. And probably by virtue of that, Apollo is a good figure for us to reflect on in terms of what our inner experience of being brothered is like, and of what kinds of relationships to men we think of as being brother-like relationships, what the character of that is. I think that also another thing that occurs to me is that because Apollo is known as the god who comes from afar, maybe Apollo is a good figure to represent our awareness of our difference from men, our awareness of the ways in which we're never going to quite get them. You know, that he is the God who comes from afar. And I think that one of the things we need to recognize here is not just that there are lots of aspects of what we think of as male ways of being and so on that are very familiar to us in an inside kind of way, but that there are also some aspects of this that are truly foreign, that we don't know how to access and so on. So Apollo might be a reminder of that. One more god I want to talk about just a moment, and that's Zeus. Zeus is, of course, the father god, the father of gods and men. He's the one who overthrew his own father, but succeeded in not ever having any of his own sons rebel in anywhere near effective way against him. So he's the father who's really assured of staying father, assured of his power. He's plotted against sometimes, but never seriously threatened. Associated with the day sky, the weather, the thunderbolt, the lightning, the mountain, with epiphanies that represent overwhelming divine energy. I think it's interesting that if you really read the stories, you discover how much of his power Zeus owes to women. Zeus owes to the grandmother who raised him, the woman who gave him the secret of how to rescue his siblings, his grandmother and mother and aunts who helped him battle against the Titans and so on, and also his alliances with his sisters and so on. So there's a lot of actual dependence on the female in the stories. Another thing that's very clearly the case with Zeus is that he represents essentially inexhaustible sexual potency. I was reading in Burkert this afternoon that someone once added up all the human and divine women that Zeus supposedly made it with, and there are at least 115 of them in Greek mythology. And of course, the mythology is full of the various ruses, tricks, metamorphoses that Zeus engaged in to get into all these various beds. He also is known as a lover of men, particularly of Ganymede, very devoted, sustained, permanent liaison. Zeus, in some ways, is such a masculine god, you know, this sexual potency, this investment in his male sexuality and that identification with the father role, with power role, and all of that. And yet, Zeus also has a more feminine side than any other of the gods, except for Dionysus. partly because early on he swallows Athena's mother, Metis, and thereby becomes someone who in his own being has feminine wisdom. And he's also, of course, the god who gives birth both to Athena and to Dionysus. As I reflect on Zeus, it seems to me that among the things that he brings up for us are all our feelings about patriarchy, all the anger that we may have about male domination. This is clearly the side of Zeus that Hera is very related to. But of course there's more to it than that. I think he also represents all the things that we love and depend on about fatherhood or about our ideal of fatherhood, which is something that Athena, who's very much identified with her father, might help us get in touch with. He certainly is identified with that inner voice of the Father that's part of our souls. It's very, very much alive in us. A voice that probably speaks differently in different ones of us. My own inner father's voice is mostly an encouraging voice. Others, I think, had the experience of it being a stifling voice, a critical voice, a judgmental voice. But the Father can speak in many different ways, and maybe speaks in more than one way to each of us. But that's part of what coming to terms with Zeus is all about. I know that I experience Zeus in some surprising ways. One of the ways I often experience Zeus is in my role as teacher, where I find that very often students come to me thinking what they need are some Demeter strokes, and that it becomes very clear to me that what I really can most appropriately give them to is a real kind of commitment to get in there and do it, an identification with their own power, their own creativity of that kind and so on, and my being the one who keeps them going, encourages them to get done with it, and so on. So I'm very aware of a real Zeus alive in me. Well, these have all been preliminary suggestions. And I want truly to apologize for the sketchiness, the tentativeness, the superficiality of what I've begun to do this evening. And I think that the way that I want to end this is simply to say that I'm very aware of the real need at this point to ask for more help from Hades. Because I see Hades as the one who pulls us into the depths of the masculine. And that's something I think is terribly important for all of us to do, to really try and engage the depths of the masculine. Okay. Finally, to questions, which, I would do whatever I can in response to, but I'm also very interested in hearing any amplification, anything that has occurred to some of the rest of you here that might be added, might complement what I've started saying, because I think that many of you might have experiences that could be added to this, and I'd really be interested in that.
I'm interested in your explaining about the ego maybe and the soul making. Would you elaborate on that a little bit?
Well, I don't know that I have too much more to say, but it's just, it's my sense that many of us women, this actually was not true of me, so this is one of those times where I can't really say me, all right? But I think many of us women are brought up in ways that encourage us to identify very much with relationship roles, very much sort of And I'm very aware of this with my mother, for instance. Maybe I'll start there. Always like to make things a little more concrete. It makes them more alive, and we really know what we're talking about. I have a mother, and I think that in some ways she was typical of her generation, who, a woman of real gift and ambitions, but who ended up over and over again making choices where she devoted her energies to her children, her husband, her mother-in-law, and less dramatically, but still importantly, also to her grandchildren. And now, in her 80s, she's angry, she's bitter about some of what she never lived. And I think she's just very aware that there was some attending to self, some kind of what we would ordinarily think of selfishness, and that's why I was calling it a kind of ego thing, a kind of sort of discovering, who I am and using those gifts and focusing on her own self that she didn't do along the way. And what I was trying to suggest is that it seems to me that, all these clear differentiations between ego and soul and anima and persona and so on, they're all helpful, but they also, if we get locked into them too much, they get in the way. And so I was just trying to suggest that it seems to me that for women sometimes it's a real soul task. It's a task of depth psychology. It's a demanding and difficult task that's part of our real becoming whole, to discover who we are in that, what we traditionally think of that ego kind of way. Does that make any sense? Well, yes, we develop our ego, we discover it, but it's not an ego that's separated from soul. It's an ego that's in a kind of living connection with soul. Because our very pull towards it is out of a care for psychic growth and development, out of a care for wholeness. Yeah.
As you were saying those words earlier, I was thinking of, I think Kierkegaard said that that's precisely what the female has to do. That the male's despair comes out of his search for soul, and his